Welcome to the Berkshires Gone By, history and folklore about the westernmost and most beautiful county in Massachusetts. I'm your host, Brooke. In the village of Lenox stands a large obelisk, a great monument that reaches high into the air. It's hard to miss, really. It stands atop an island of green in the middle of the intersection where West Street, Main Street, Walker Street, and Old Stockbridge Road meet, and is often used as a landmark when giving out-of-towners directions. But it's not just a plainly visible object by which to point lost Kripalu patrons the way. It's obviously in honor of something, or someone. So how about in this episode we discovered who it was that inspired the spire? This monument is dedicated to Paterson and Egleston, and it isn't far from one of the homes of one of those it's dedicated to. Right across the road, at the corner of West Street and Main Street, 7 Main Street to be precise, stands a stately old house. It's a Federal-style home with a large front yard, and was built by Major General John Paterson. He was born in 1744 in the town of New Britain, Connecticut. His father had been a military man, and his mother, Ruth, had to be a strong woman to keep the house, as her husband seemed to be always away. She had 4 daughters and 1 son, John Jr. He enrolled in Yale, where he studied law and graduated in 1762 at the age of 18. Free from his studies, he returned home, and just weeks later, a message came from Havana, where his father had been stationed. His father, John Sr., was dead. It was suddenly the younger John Paterson's job to take care of his family. He first became a teacher, teaching law, before he began to practice it a few years later. He practiced law for some time, serving as a justice of the peace in his hometown. In 1774, he moved north to Lenox, Massachusetts. That would be a busy year for him. He was both elected to the Massachusetts General Court and met and married Elizabeth Lee, the only child of Hannah and Joseph Lee. Elizabeth was described as attractive and capable. Just before their move, they had stayed in the home of his mother and his sister. After their move to Lenox, his new father-in-law came to live with them. Almost right away, John was given the job of clerk. His task was to manage the property that the towns of Richmond and Stockbridge consisted of. His new prosperity allowed the couple to move into a lovely white home that John Paterson had had built for them. This is the one at the corner that I was telling you about earlier, and it is indeed stately. But this wasn't the beginning of a blissful married life, not as they had hoped, because Paterson may have been given the job of clerk of the property that was Lenox, Richmond, and Stockbridge in 1744, but he'd also be the last one given this job, and he didn't even make a single entry in the record book pertaining to it. You see, this was a time when the entire area was owned by England, and Paterson was a patriot. He was on the side of those who wanted to break from the rule of the old world, and he could see the writing on the wall, and was hell-bent on helping. So, instead of doing his job as clerk in April of 1775, John chose to attend the First Provincial Congress in Boston, and what he heard there was what he needed to inspire himself to action. He returned to the Berkshires, and on his way through Pittsfield spoke to a crowd about the impending war, that this was serious, and a fight for their freedom from the old world was now necessary. When he got back to Lenox, Paterson not only joined the Minutemen, he organized them, and they didn't get much time to ponder what was about to happen, because it happened almost right away. They were called for when news of the Battle of Lexington and Concord reached them, and John and his militiamen marched all the way to Boston to push the British Army back. John Paterson's bravery and skill, in addition to the fact that he founded his unit, earned him the command of the 1st Massachusetts Regiment when it came time that it needed a new leader. He led them into the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Americans did not actually win this battle. The British won. However, the American colonial forces took a massive bite out of the British, which only proved to boost the morale of the Americans later on. John Paterson also led his troops during the invasion of Canada, which did not go so well. And it seemed that even when not fighting the British, he was fighting. At one point, a fire engulfed the barracks of his camp, and he led the battle to put it out. John Paterson was even there when Washington crossed the Delaware. This took place on Christmas night, the 25th into the 26th, when Washington and his army crossed to New Jersey. George Washington first read American Crisis by Thomas Paine to his men, to inspire them to push forward. Then, in the dark of night, they crossed to surprise the enemy. Failure was not an option. Failure that night would have meant the loss of the war. It took hours to get the men, the horses, and the equipment to the other side of the river. And by 5 a.m., the snowy and cold weather had gotten worse. The men, hungry and ill-clothed, were already in rough enough shape. But they still managed to surprise the enemy, an army of Hessians fighting for the English, and the battle began suddenly. Some of the Hessians were still rolling out of bed, waking to the shouts of their fellow soldiers, fumbling for their guns, while on the other side, the Americans were ready to fight, and noticing that their ambush had worked. The Americans, emboldened, fought with ample vigor, and 2 hours later, the Hessians surrendered. They marched their prisoners back 20 miles to their camp on the other side of the river. But again they would cross the river to New Jersey, Washington, for a second time, looking to take advantage of his men's newfound confidence and of the lower morale of his enemies. In the deep snow they crossed the Delaware, yet again. They had to break ice to get their boats across. But they did it. They got to Trenton. And for a second time, Washington and his men, and John Paterson, were victorious. Life during war was hard for a Berkshire soldier, as with any colonial soldier, really. But as an English boy might make it to adulthood and never have held a gun, as hunting wild game was mostly forbidden, or at least heavily regulated, a boy from New England was raised to hunt and never waste a bullet. So despite hardships, their experience and frugality often led to victory. But their uniforms were often homegrown and of thin material, as material had become harder and harder to get, the more that people had left to go to the fronts. And their camps were just as disarrayed, for the most part consisting of mismatched clusters of tents, huts, lean-tos, and teepees made of practically whatever they could get their hands on. No two were ever the same. More battles passed, and John Paterson's rank was advanced. Paterson's incredible bravery enthralled his men and made for a phenomenal track record when it came to re-enlistments from them. He seemed to always be everywhere and to have his fingers in all the pies at once. There was no duty he wouldn't volunteer for and put his whole heart into. His wife at home would wait anxiously for letters. And then, suddenly, the war was over, and John Paterson came home. At about the age of 49, he and his wife moved away, leaving the big white house behind. They relocated to the town of Liesel, New York. In 1793, he became a member of the New York State Assembly, and it was 1802 when Deborah Sampson came to visit. Deborah Sampson, born on the 17th of December, 1760, had fought for John during the war. How was this? At a time when women were not allowed in battle? Why, she simply disguised herself as a man, of course. She's been described as a rather tall woman with strong features. and it was easy enough for her to fill out a man's uniform. She had served for almost a year and a half, while using the name Robert Shirtliff, but when she was wounded, it was discovered by the physician that she was in fact a woman, and she was honorably discharged in 1783. John, impressed by her courage, was happy to have her visit. From 1803 to 1805, John Paterson served as a congressman in the 8th United States Congress. It was 3 years later that he passed away. When he was buried in New York State, he wasn't given a monument of any kind, except a very small headstone. His wife, who had been in Spencerport, New York, visiting her sister, passed away there rather suddenly and was buried in the cemetery of that town. Thus husband and wife were sadly separated in death. Thus they stayed for quite some time, but it didn't seem right that a cherished hero of Lenox should be hardly remembered in a place so far away. So in 1892, 84 years later, he and his wife were relocated to the church on the hill with great fanfare, and laid to rest beside 2 of their daughters, and the great spire, the wonderful obelisk monument, was put up for them at the crossroads, down in the village below, right there in front of his lovely old house. Large regal headstones were erected in the cemetery for all of them, far more suited to the war hero he'd become. Not only was this his hometown during his grand exploits during the Revolutionary War, but it was also where much of his family was buried. The other name upon this grand monument is Egleston. Azariah Egleston was born in Sheffield, Massachusetts, on the 23rd of February, 1757. He was the child of Seth Egleston and Rachel Church. The couple had moved to the Berkshires a little after marrying, and before having kids, of which they had quite a few. Azariah was the second oldest of 6 children. John Paterson had just come back from attending the Provincial Congress in Boston, and was in Pittsfield the same day that Azariah and his brothers were there. Paterson told the people that had gathered around that it was time that the young nation pushed the old one out, and that men of the Berkshires should ready themselves for possible war. Azariah, only 18 at the time, and his brothers didn't need any more convincing, and joined while they were there on the 29th of April, 1775. He became a private in the militia created by John Paterson, in the company nicknamed the Flower of the Berkshires, and commanded by Captain Noble. Azariah was not content to just be another soldier. He threw himself into recruiting more men to fight for independence. About the time he and his brothers joined up, word of the Battle of Lexington reached them. Without a moment's hesitation, the fresh-faced youths marched to Cambridge to take part in the battle. His regiment was the first on the field, and was key in defending the city of Boston during the Battle of Bunker Hill. He served for 8 months, but when his enlistment ran out, he hung around for another month and a half before re-enlisting under Captain Noble again, this time for a year. Azariah took part in many battles, often crossing paths with John Paterson. Azariah was also there during the crossing of the Delaware with General George Washington. John Hancock made Azariah an ensign on May 18, 1776, and he was promoted to lieutenant when he fought with Washington at Valley Forge. Then, when working for General Ashley and John Paterson, he earned the rank of major. John Paterson respected Azariah Egleston so much that after the war, it was with his blessing that Azariah married Paterson's daughter Hannah after he came home to the Berkshires and moved to Lenox. There he took up a normal life for the first time, working as a justice of the peace, just as his father-in-law had. Azariah Egleston became well known and well liked in the town. In fact, the whole county. He was so interested in education that he gave the land which became Lenox Academy, and the money with which to build it. He even got one Mr. Gleason to come and teach there. Renowned for his skills, the school became the institution to attend for boys and girls. And Major Egleston threw dinner parties for the students at his own home. Azariah also became interested in evolving farming techniques to improve the yield of farmland and animals. He was a member of the Massachusetts Agricultural Society. In addition to all of this, he even helped found the Trinity Church in Lenox. He kept his position as Justice of the Peace for nearly 30 years. He also represented the District Court in the House of Representatives for 4 years. And he was also the Assistant Marshal of the towns of Stockbridge, Turingham, Lenox, Pittsfield, Beckett, West Stockbridge, Peru, Richmond, Hinsdale, Washington, Dalton, and Lee. He was a Massachusetts state senator until 1809, but just before he turned 62, on January 13th, 1822, he passed away and was buried at the church on the hill. His home, just across the road, later became the Birchwood Inn. But there is so much more to know about Egleston and Paterson. If I were to focus on it all in this episode, it would be hours upon hours long. Their exploits were outstanding. The people they met, the battles they fought in, the undertakings that they accomplished are absolutely worth reading more about. And if you want to do that, you can do it for free. Far more wonderful information can be found at archive.org. There you can search Biographical Notice of Major Azariah Egleston of the Revolutionary Army and read a biography of his life that was published in 1892. Or search for The Life of John Paterson, Major General in the Revolutionary Army, which was published in 1898. Simple internet searches do nothing by way of enlightening the reader to the fascinating exploits of these two people, but these old books certainly do. And I encourage you to have a look. Besides, they're free. This has been The Berkshires Gone By. Created, written, directed, and read by myself, Brooke Renier, and co-produced by Deanna Garner. You can see old pictures from Berkshire history by finding us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. You can also find episodes on Facebook, YouTube, or www.theberkshiresgoneby.com, where you can find images related to each topic and every episode made. We hope you'll join us for our next episode. Thanks for listening.